My full name is Vanita Witherspoon Nicolas. I've been a Nicolas for over 40 years now. My husband and I have been married here. But the actual year that I was born in January 1948, January 4th, 1948, in St. Louis, Missouri.
Very good. And can you just begin to describe what it was like growing up in St. Louis, maybe something about the neighborhood, of course the family, especially the family, your father, your mother, siblings, whoever you'd like to talk about, but give us a picture into that life.
Well, growing up in St. Louis in I was 50s, we'll say, and I graduated in 65 and left St. Louis and haven't been back since 65 from high school. Mm-hmm. Right. So my father was a lawyer and my mother was a college professor. When I was born, she was an English teacher at one of the local high schools, but during our lifetime, she got several advanced degrees herself, including a PhD. So she went on into the college system as a college counselor at St. Louis Community College. But in terms of probably what we would call Black America, because it was a segregated city, I remember my parents doing picketing, and I knew there were places that we could not go as children. It was just two of us, my older brother, who was born in 1945, and me. So we were very much, I wouldn't say sheltered, but we were privileged. I mean, my father was a lawyer. in terms of higher education and the professional world, that meant something. And my mother was a teacher, absolutely. So you almost couldn't, doctors, lawyers, and Indians, whatever the saying goes, you just couldn't do any better. So I had a great childhood.
Wonderful. And your father was, did he work in a firm? Was it his own?
It was his own.
Yes.
His whole story was very interesting back in the 50s. He graduated from Howard Law School in probably the last of 30s, early 40s, because he moved to St. Louis after he graduated from law school at Howard. It was that was interesting too, because he was born in Charleston, South Carolina. So from Charleston, he ended up at Howard's Law School. And the way that he's told us in the stories that we remember, after law school, he had worked at a hotel as a doorman. You open the door for people who come into hotels in the DC area. And he had saved his money. And after graduation, he went to the train station in DC and said, "This is all the money I have, how far can I go?" And the person who was doing the ticket said, "You can get to about St. Louis, Missouri." He said, "Okay, I'm going to St. Louis." And that was how he ended up there. He didn't know anyone there.
Yeah.
But he was a lawyer, so they tend to have connections all over because of the legal profession. And he started his own law firm.
And was it mostly, it was a black
It was definitely.
only, right?
Yes.
We were talking about segregation.
Definitely
Yes.
segregated.
And then, is that where he met your mother?
Actually, my mother's from Houston. So my mother was the only child born and raised in Houston. And both of my parents were very, very religious. I mean, not only was every Sunday church, but we went to church Sunday evenings. We went to church on Monday for drama classes, and Tuesday for scouting events, and Wednesday for choir rehearsal. So my father was also in the circle of Baptist ministers of Baptist conventions. And my mother was also very religious as well. So they met in Houston at a Baptist convention. He had traveled there to one of the annual conventions, and my mom was there. And they met in Houston, and probably 2 years later, they were married, and of course, she moved to St. Louis. That's why I was due, following her husband.
So for those who probably don't have any idea, that because we don't know who's going to see this, can you say a little bit about the role of the church in the African American community, especially at that time?
Absolutely. It was the staple. It was where the gatherings were. It was one of the things that unified, I don't want to say all of us, but there were friends that I had from church that I only saw at church. We didn't go to the same schools. There's this organization of black professionals, I'll call them, and it's called Jack and Jill. And Jack and Jill as an organization was a unique group of families whose children were, again, doctors and lawyers' children. So therefore, they also had that kind of aspiration that their children would, of course, become the same. But even though there were segregated times, we always wanted more for our children than for ourselves. So if it weren't for the children I met in Jack and Jill, some of whom you may know, but the church, I spent way more time in church than in any other social groups, because Jack and Jill parents met once a month, and they had activities for their children based on the age group. And it was also a social connection for these wives who were wives of doctors and wives of lawyers, and sometimes their only job was raising their children. Many of them were housewives, but their focus was always on the children. Well, because my parents were so involved with the church, I spent more time in church and in church gatherings and church events and church conventions. And I sang in the choir at church. I learned to play the piano at church. And it was similar to what we think about when sometimes the big impression of like a Dr. Martin Luther King, you know, that the King gatherings were in churches.
Yes.
And that's where groups of black people felt safe. That's where we felt connected. And that's where we felt God was also present, and then therefore a direction in our lives. And that's why the church was just, it was honestly to this day, the people that I still know in St. Louis are my church friends.
Nice, very good. Let's stay with your father. So he grew up in South Carolina.
Yes, he did.
Do you have stories about that?
My father was one of 16 children. He had that many brothers and sisters. He was a middle child. So he had as many older children as younger children. And he was born in 1909. So that was in Bennettsville, South Carolina. A town called Bennettsville. And I guess it's still on the map, of course, but the closest major city was Charleston. But Bennettsville, South Carolina.
Closest was Charleston.
That's what yes, that's how I know it.
Yes.
Yes. So he, as a family of 16, everybody had a job to do or a role to play. The older children took care of the younger children. The younger children were also a part of this family concept where, and I don't know that my paternal grandparents were farmers or anything like that. I know very little about them, but I do know that my dad's brothers and sisters tended to be either self-employed, entrepreneurial, with an entrepreneurial spirit, or we had one who was a nurse. I had an uncle who was a pharmacist, and he owned his own pharmacy. Well, the nurse clearly worked in a hospital, but he owned his own pharmacy. I had an uncle who owned a cleaners. We had an aunt who was a teacher. So no matter what the goal of a big family is, back in the early 1900s, the cousins and the uncles and us that I knew all tended to be very successful, but owning their own businesses.
Yes.
And most of them left South Carolina as well.
They did.
All the ones I've met were either in New York, in New Jersey, in the Atlantic City area. The one who owned his pharmacy was in Memphis, Tennessee, and most of them are still in the New York area.
Again, to leave the South.
That's the South, absolutely.
Okay, very
absolutely.
good. So then, your mother. What do you know about her parents?
Well, my mother was an only child.
Okay.
So her parents were, her maiden name was Lily, and her mom was a baker. She worked in a bakery. She was an excellent cook, but she also, as a profession, was a baker. She baked, and I guess that's the word you call a person who works in a bakery, of course. She didn't own the bakery, but She was
Wow.
the #1 employee.
Very good.
And my mother's life was spent around the church as well. If you look at the history of Houston, Texas, you'll find my grandmother's name. And the church, the first black church in Houston was called Antioch. And it's still there today. It's in downtown Houston, but it's surrounded by, of course, tall buildings as downtowns are. But she was a very much a cornerstone of that church. And oh, by the way, my mother, being an only child, was very close to her mother, and I'm named after my grandmother. There are very few Vanitas around that spell their name like I do, and I'm the exact name of my grandmother. I think children used to do that. They used to name their children after their parents, but yeah.
And
so that's where her connection. I don't know much about her dad. I don't.
Okay.
I do know that she was divorced and remarried, and her dad had other children. I only met one of them because my time in Houston was very brief, although every summer we went to Houston to spend time with our grandparents, and we spent June and July there. And
what was that like?
It was different.
Yeah.
St. Louis is a city.
Yeah.
Houston at that time was more like a country city. It was very, in my opinion, I'll just call it country city and leave it at that.
Yeah.
The house that my grandmother and grandparents lived in had I call it, it's not a moat, but it had a ditch outside. So when it rained, and in Houston it rains a lot, we could go outside and play in the ditch in the water. And some of the sidewalks weren't paved in the area where they lived. And of course in St. Louis, every sidewalk was paved. It was just a very different thing. But because we were with our grandparents, and when you're children, you're children. You accept what you see as the norm. And because it was, I won't call Houston segregated, but it's just that our grandmother didn't take us to places that other than church or church camp or church choir rehearsal. We lived in a very sheltered, we spent our summers in a very sheltered part of Houston.
It was, you said Houston was not segregated?
Well, do you want that story?
I absolutely.
You know why they call it the Lone Star State? No. I won't even go into that story, but that's an interesting story. If you look up why Houston is the Lone Star State, it had to do with slavery. It had to do with not even wanting to be a part of the U.S., but it had a very different vibe, we call it, from St. Louis. St. Louis was very close to Chicago. St. Louis was right on the Mississippi River. St. Louis had a different draw of people than Houston.
Interesting.
But my small part of Houston, although it was 17 summers, was just sitting around my grandmother and her church. Now her husband, my grandfather, was worked on the railroads. Worked on the railroads. And we, of course, at that time traveled by train. Traveling to Houston. By the time my brother and I were probably 8 and 10, we took the train to Houston because our grandfather and godfather were both Pullman porters, and they were on the route that went from St. Louis to Houston, and so they watched out for us. We had our private drawing room. We never sat in coach. We, you know, we were very privileged children, and we lived a good life. And we still do.
Wonderful. So this is your mother's side of the family.
The Houston side.
And so your parents meet in Texas?
Yes, at church
and then
convention.
At church, and then they get married and then come to St. Louis?
My dad was already here.
He was already in St.
Louis.
And then, so she moves with him to St. Louis. What was it like for you? I know you say you come from a family of privilege. I understand that, but can you describe what St. Louis was like?
Yes, St. Louis was segregated. You know, it's right that border of the Mason-Dixon line too. St. Louis was segregated, so I went to a all-black elementary school. I went to well, interestingly enough, by the time I was in middle school, or what we would call middle school, or junior high, actually called it junior high at that time, integration was beginning to happen, and that meant
This is
this would have been
six.
okay. So the
When-
Brown decision, which was to integrate education, was 54,
Four, yes.
and I was 6 years old then. So
Okay,
this
I see.
would have been
Yeah.
10 years after Brown. But you know, integration came slowly. It was not overnight. And and of course, integration was one way, where black students
exactly.
went to an all-white
Yeah.
school, and we would be 3 or 5 out of 100 students.
Did your parents decided that you should go
Yes,
to the white school?
yes.
And what was that like for you?
Well, my mom was the counselor at my high school, so I rode to school and back with her. So I still felt protected. But the junior high school, I took a bus. We took the bus, not the yellow school bus, it was public transportation from the block from my house straight, and you get off the bus at the street called Natural Bridge, and so I'm a block from the school. So we was friends, so we walked together, and we just accepted it. It was okay. I was never harmed. I mean, you always call names when you get into a certain part of town, but that's their problem. That wasn't my problem. And because my parents were who they were, I never felt afraid, or I never felt that I was going to be, I knew who I was. And one of the reasons the elementary school had prepared us so well, I tested gifted in the 5th grade, and so they want the gifted students to go to other school where there were gifted programs. So I always felt very comfortable in my own skin, my own environment. And again, I think it's because my mom was a teacher, my dad was a lawyer. My mom, we read books every day. I could read when I was 3, 4, 5. I just played the piano. We went to concerts. Yes, we sat in the balcony, but we still went. We listened to Mozart and Chopin and the classics. My mother read not only books written by black people, but she also read the classics because she was an English teacher. So I felt very comfortable as to who I was, and nobody could intimidate me.
Nice. Very good. So what happened after high school?
Well, the high school that I was supposed to go to finally was being integrated the year that I went, which would have been 1961. And as there were, I don't want to call them race riots because they weren't race riots, but there was clearly a little hostility. The white students did not want the black students to attend. And what tends to happen is what we call white flight, or what happens is the white parents who can move further from the city, and they began to move out of the high school that I would have been in, or I went there for 3 years. And then when they moved to the suburbs or to the outskirts of town, they built a new school, fancy smancy, all the newest, latest, and greatest. And so at both times, my mother was my high school counselor at the school that we integrated the high school. And then when I had to move because of the gifted students were moved to a different school, she was the counselor there as well. So I felt, again, never worried about anything because I was with my mom, and we had a car, and we just ignored the rhetoric and the taunts and the jeers and the ignorance. And it was never physical, it was just verbal. White kids would call us names, or some of my classmates who had to catch a bus to go back home, they would stand at the bus stop, and this wasn't a yellow school bus, this was public transportation. And the white kids would drive by in their cars and call them names, and a couple times they would spit at them, but it was it was never, I don't know if the word is, it was never violent.
Yes.
It was never
No, I
violent.
understand.
But St. Louis was changing, and integration is hard for some people to accept.
So then you graduate from high school.
Yes.
And then what did you decide to
I
do?
went to college at Fisk University in Nashville, Tennessee. And Fisk at the time, and still is, one of the,
Historic.
yes, it's
Black
an
college.
HBCU, definitely, historically black colleges and universities. And it had that, it was where John Lewis went. It was, it has a connection with W.B. Du Bois. It had connection with some of the great artists and writers of the times. So it was, of course, the place where I would be. At the time, we were not trying to integrate some university. This was the best place for me. And of course, my dad having gone to Howard, that would have been my second choice to go to Howard as well. But I ended up, my roommate, her dad was a judge from Detroit. My other friends were, there was one classmate named whose last name was Branton. Her father was the attorney general from Arkansas. Tony would have to connect that part for you, but I mean, Fisk was where my kind of teenagers went.
Yes. And what did you study?
My major, I wanted to be a lawyer, so it was very interesting. And either when you want to be a lawyer, you're either poli-sci major or political science, or your history major. So they gave me all these history classes, and I don't like history. I said, this is not what I want to learn, more history. I want, and so I changed my major to languages. I majored in Spanish, and I minored in French and German, and so the major is called Modern Foreign Languages. So I was, because in the gifted programs in St. Louis, you took French. I started learning French in the 7th grade. I learned French all throughout 7th grade and continued in high school. So when I got to Fisk, I said, okay, I don't want to learn French anymore, but let's learn some Spanish. So I majored in Spanish, and they're both Romance languages. So it was easy connection. And I really majored in Spanish and minored with French and German.
And then did you, after Fisk, was there?
So after Fisk, I went to law school.
Where?
I finally got
Where?
to. Oh, I went to law school in Houston.
Okay.
So I ended up back in Houston at Texas Southern University School of Law.
Very nice.
And at the time, it was the name was changed to Thurgood Marshall School of Law, because what I discovered in undergrad school was that law schools don't require a major. They require good grades, LSAT scores, extracurricular activities, those kinds of things. So it did not matter that I did not major in what the tradition was. My grades in languages were always A's and excellent, and I had extracurricular activities. I was all of those great things that made law school come easy.
So you enjoyed it?
I loved it. I love school. I still teach.
Nice.
To this day.
So what did you, what aspect of law did you study?
Well, in law school you have to study all of it.
All of it, I see.
Yeah,
Okay.
you have to study all of it. And the other irony about it was I loved watching my father practice law. I would go to court with him many times while I was a child. And I was always fascinated by how the legal process worked, even though it didn't always work in our favor. My father was a part of a very famous lawsuit in St. Louis that was an attack on racial covenants, the restrictive covenants at the time where deeds for real estate, that you could not sell this real estate to anyone other than.
Yes.
So
other than white people.
White people.
Yes.
Yes. So my father helped to break down that barrier. At the same time, Thurgood Marshall was breaking down these educational barriers. And I saw what the legal system could do if you knew it. But it wasn't something easy to learn. So most people didn't think about learning law to be an advocate for what's right. And my whole thing about the problem with it, though, was my father worked very hard. He went to court every day. He studied, we would call legal research, every night. And the collaboration between black lawyers at the time, so that they could do little cases along the way to set precedents, and so that you could finally change the big case in the Supreme Court. It was hard work, and it took time away from everything else you wanted to do.
Of course.
So I didn't want to work that hard when I got out of law school.
So your father was really quite instrumental
Oh, yes.
in doing away with some of these very
Yes.
segregated, discriminating
He was absolutely,
law.
especially as related to St. Louis.
Mm.
Yes, he absolutely was. And the landmark decision is called Shelley versus Kramer, is the one that went to the U.S. Supreme Court. But along the way, there were smaller landmark cases.
Shelley versus Kramer, your father?
Yes, he was an
Oh,
attorney
how
on that
amazing.
case. Yes. And that was the case that dealt with restrictive covenants, starting with St. Louis. And as a matter of fact, as a result, we were the first black family who bought a house on the in the block where we
Great.
lived. Yes, and those kinds
So,
of changes,
that's
and
fabulous.
because I was very young then,
Sure.
I didn't realize what was happening. But in hindsight, we were definitely not only making changes in the law, but changes on the ground. We were the first black family
Amazing.
on this private street gated community
Amazing.
where I grew up.
Wow.
It's the only home I knew.
So you finished law school,
Yes.
and then what?
I said, okay, my dad wanted me to come back to St. Louis to practice with him, and I just kind of didn't want to go back to St. Louis. It was not on my list of things to do, and I said, okay, but before I do, I'm going to travel some. So I came to LA on it was either a bar convention related matter or high school reunion or something, but I decided to come visit California. And once you get to LA, it's hard to go back. So I
Why?
moved here in 1975. Well, it's not
Why?
St. Louis, that's for sure.
Yes, yes,
And it was
yes.
Houston. I just couldn't take the weather.
Yes.
That
okay.
was just really unreal.
Yeah.
Constant humidity. I mean, yes,
Yeah,
St. Louis had
yeah.
summers, but in the winter we had snow and we had
Yeah.
regular
Yeah,
season. I just didn't like Houston.
Sure.
So I said, I'm not
Yeah.
staying here either.
Yeah.
But I ended up in LA
Mm-hmm.
in the 70s, and I said, oh yeah, I could stay here. This is this is nice. And I had taught. I started teaching when I was in law school. Because I have a
Yes.
Spanish background, I taught ESL and Spanish thing in Houston. It also had a large Spanish-speaking population, so I taught in the community college system there while I was in law school. And when I came to LA, I said, okay, I can try to teach that LA community college system. And so I did, and so I stayed.
And what did you teach?
I started off by teaching ESL.
At ESL.
Yeah,
Okay.
I started
Very
teaching
good.
at LA City College and Southwest College here.
Ah,
And because ESL classes are always needed.
sure.
And
sure.
when you're new, they not only give you the Saturday class or the
Yes.
night class or
Right.
the class in the community that's not on campus.
Yeah.
But I said, I can do it.
Mm.
So I taught ESL in several different places.
Southwest.
Until I could get a law position because
Yeah.
I wanted to teach in the paralegal programs.
okay.
And we called it the law department at LA City College. And of course, professors don't leave often. They stay,
Yes,
and they stay, and
yes,
they stay.
I know.
And then beyond retirement age, they stay and they're still on.
Yes.
Once you get that tenure, you're not going.
Exactly.
So
Yeah.
it was difficult to get into the law position, but I started teaching ESL.
And then you
And then
eventually.
yes, eventually,
You got into the law.
yeah, I got a position at LA City College in the law department, which included their paralegal program, criminal justice, which they call administration of justice, and corrections. It's the whole picture of law, either the legal system, the police system, and then the prison system. And what I think happened was, it's not that I think that this is pretty well documented. What the college was required to do in the mid-70s was integrate the faculty because the faculty tended to be all white male. And the demand came, your student base isn't all white male, so you need women teachers and you need black teachers. That was part of, some people call it affirmative action, and it was during the era of affirmative action,
Yeah.
but I didn't get it because of those reasons. I got it
course,
because I was qualified.
Of course.
Yeah, so I was hired as the
Wonderful.
only, as I think to this day, I may have been the only black teacher.
To this
Woman
day?
faculty, I think so.
Mm.
I know there's a woman there now who was a lawyer in the college district, but to this day, and I left there after 30 years or whatever number, there were no other women who came, full-time faculty who came after me, and no black women.
Wow.
The police science program, of course, had black police officers who taught with us in the corrections section as well, but in the what we call the paralegal program,
No.
I was the only one for 20 years from 79, 20 full-time years. If I count
Yes,
the part-time
yes,
years,
sure.
it's even more.
Sure.
From 75 and to 99, and then I lateraled from City College to West LA College, and was still the only black full-time person in my department there,
Man or woman?
both.
The only black
Yeah.
person. This is 90s?
Well, I retired from there in 2013,
Wow.
and I retired as the only full-time in my department. Now, of course, in other departments there were others, but in my department I was the only black full-time woman.
So LA was very different.
Oh, very. Yes. I mean, LA, you just gotta love it because there's so much here to do and you can find your niche
Yeah,
and then you're happy.
wonderful.
Yeah,
Good.
and so I found my niche.
And is there anything you'd like to say about your brother?
Well, my brother also moved from St. Louis. He married his high school sweetheart.
Okay.
And at that time, corporate America was hiring, again, more black people, and she got hired by Xerox. So she was hired by Xerox in their office in Alexandria, Virginia. So, which was
Your sister, I'm sorry.
Excuse
did
me,
I-
my sister-in-law.
Oh, your sister-in-law. Okay.
Yes. So my brother and his wife
Yes.
moved from St. Louis to Alexandria, Virginia,
Okay.
because of her unique job position with Xerox. And he was working with a program that was funded by Title VII, which was Title VII.
Yeah,
Okay, yeah, that's homework for all of us, figure out what Title VII does. But the point was,
Can you say what Title VII does for the recording? Just
I-
briefly.
I think Title VII, because that was his job, not
Yes,
mine.
yes, no, I know.
What is related to parents' rights for their children in education.
Okay.
You know, we kind of know what Title IX did.
Right, right.
But Title
But-
VII even preceded it.
Yes, okay.
And it made parents more aware of the impact that they could have on their child's public education.
Okay.
So he went around the country speaking to high school parents and even middle school parents about their rights under Title
Nice,
VII.
nice.
And so he still lives in Virginia.
He's still
yes,
okay.
he-
Yes.
They moved
okay,
there,
Yeah.
and he still lives there. Loved it. They never went back to St. Louis either. I mean, they went to visit.
Yes.
But
Yes.
they made
So
a life.
you have
Virginia.
children?
I have 3 children
You
and
have-
5 grandchildren.
Nice.
Yes.
And are they? Would you like to speak about them or not?
We have that much time? Yes. I have a son who is about to be 45. And all of my children were born and raised in Los Angeles. And then I have 2 daughters who are something like 38 and 35. I stopped doing the numbers.
That's okay. Sure.
And my son worked in the tech business. He was until they moved tech inside. His last position was in Silicon Valley, working for one of these gaming industries, because they were making the games, but he was connecting the computers and setting up the
Nice.
technology, and made sure that the office and everything was taken care of, and all of the incoming and outgoing processes of running the building were a part of his responsibility. And my daughter, I have 2. The older daughter, she's so much like, I'll just say like my mom. I won't say she's so much like me. Children don't like to hear you say they're like their parents, but she has an engineering degree from Stanford. She also has an MBA from USC. She's still single, no children, no husband. She travels the world every other month I mean, she's been to places that I've never even heard of. She's very happy, very millennial. She's in that 30-something group where they're career-oriented, and not trying to be somebody's housewife or wife or mother. She has 2 godchildren, 4 nieces and nephews, and she says, I don't need any children. I've got godchildren and nieces and nephews, and she's a doll, though. She's just so bright and so intelligent. And I won't say it's because of Stanford. In order to get to Stanford, you need 18 years of the foundation.
Of course, yeah.
But by being her high school valedictorian, she also tap dances. We didn't even get into that part of my life. But the other reality is she calls her own shots.
Good.
She's a very independent, well-thought, well-read, well-bred. And by being my first daughter, I think I raised her kind of like my mom raised me. I read to her all the time. I took her to concerts. We went to plays. We were in Jack and Jill. You know, I created an environment for her of successful people. And when you create an environment of success for your children, then your children tend to become like the environment. And then her little sister came along. And my second daughter they are like night and day. My daughter, Kathy, is the love of everybody's life. She could care less about you sitting down reading a book to her. She wanted to go dance. She wanted to go play. She wanted to be around other people. She brings the party with her.
Nice.
And she is still carrying on the dance legacy of the Nicolas family name. She has 2 children. She's married with 2 children, a boy and a girl. And her 2 children are, I mean, you talk about wanting to be a grandmother before being a mother. I love my grandchildren so much. I wish I could have had them without the work of having children.
Yes.
But her oldest child is my granddaughter, my first granddaughter, who went off to Fisk University last month.
Nice.
She's carrying on my legacy, I think, at Fisk. Of course, she's her own person, and she grew up with a mom who was a dancer. So she dances, and actually, she was a cheerleader, and she started doing competitive cheer in the 7th grade. So my granddaughter and I went to cheer competitions all over the country, and I just loved traveling with her. She was such a delight. And so now that she's at Fisk, she's trying out for cheerleading, and she got selected.
Great.
So now she's a cheerleader in her first semester in college, and she's so happy, and I just miss her.
Sure.
But my second grandchild is a boy. He plays baseball. And I've traveled with him to baseball tournaments. As a matter of fact, in July, we were in Honolulu. We were in Hawaii at one of his baseball tournaments. And
What league? What?
it's a traveling team. The team that was in Hawaii is called Top League. It's all local based.
Okay.
It's called top level baseball. He was on his high school team, of course, as well. But the high school team is seasonal. And so in the summer, they weren't kind of doing baseball, but the traveling teams are they call sometimes club teams. They do year-round, and they go compete in other cities and with other teams.
Very nice. So I want to go back, if you would speak about, the question was, what would you tell the younger generation today of African Americans? And your concern, well, you mentioned, have we made it too easy? If you could just talk about that.
Yeah, sometimes my own personal struggle is that, especially as I look at my daughters, and my son, of course, as well, but they never struggled. They never, well, first of all, growing up in St. Louis, there was segregation and there was racism. They were born and raised in LA. They've never seen segregation or what we would call racism,
Sure.
but they're still there. It's still there. And recognizing it is one thing, but realizing that when you compare what the African American community has, no matter how, quote, privileged we think we are, and compare it to other communities, we are still near the bottom of the totem pole. We're still near the bottom of housing equality in terms of home ownership. We're still near the bottom with business ownership. I mean, to try and get a business loan as a black person, it's just, you can't do it. It's just, there was no real path for business equality and self-sufficiency. In terms of education, yes, we can go to the integrated schools that are in around us, but when you get there, look around and see who else is there and how they got there. It's just a reality factor that this generation, and I'll just call them the millennials, just put everybody in that 30s category.
Right.
They were pampered, I think. The ones I know, they are pampered. They, you know, it's like that silver spoon concept. They never had to struggle. They never had to work. They never had to pay the way and pave the way that their parents, not just their grandparents even, had to do to get to where they are. And I hope that they realize that, remember that they stand on shoulders. They don't stand on feet. They stand on shoulders. And those people who gave their, not just their lives, but their livelihood. I mean, look at the Rosa Parks example. She had to leave town, move from Montgomery just to stay alive. And that is a very common occurrence in the black community. Many of our ancestors fled the cities where they left because the Klan was coming after them, or somebody was going to burn down their home. And that kind of leaving everything you know and, well, I'll just call it fleeing up north or to the west is something that, starting over. And starting in a steel mill or starting in a, I don't even, as a cook, you know, not the waitress job, but as a cook in the back. Yeah, that's what many of the people who we knew, and I'm sure my parents, brothers and sisters and generations left the South because of the lack of opportunity and because of the treatment of the white establishment. My LA kids don't know anything about that. And their friends don't, because their friends are the people who we have insulated them with all the way through school. And yes, they've all gone to college, but even at Stanford, for example, my daughter's closest friends to this day are 5 black women. She was never quite accepted by the white community at Stanford. I mean, you know, she went to school, she got an engineering degree, she graduated on time, blah, blah, but beyond that, she's still a young black woman with young black friends. And that's what's so ironic about, and because of her education and her abilities, she can fit in any job that she goes for. She has never been refused a position and all of those good things, but
it's still there.
It's different. Yeah, it's definitely still there.
And I guess the last thing I want to ask is, do you think is there much talk about the history? You said young people should know the history, like in your family.
My family knows my husband's history.
Okay.
Because they're Nicolases, they definitely know the Nicolas side. But that's so interesting a question, because when you're an entertainer, you get to hear you get to think of the glamour side, the glamorous side of it. You can never get to talk about, and I'm sure he will, the times where they were in Las Vegas and on stage with Frank Sinatra, but they couldn't stay in the same hotel. They had to be some motel down the street. Or like the Dorothy Dandridge story where she was at the Sands or whatever hotel it was and went swimming. And that night they drained the pool because a black person had gotten
This
in the
was
water.
who? I'm sorry, Dorothy?
Dorothy Dandridge.
Oh, oh.
Yeah, Tony, I have to tell that story. And this is how the subtle racism that even celebrities had and saw. Not to mention that they didn't play the big venues that
Sure.
their counterparts, if you can call them counterparts, you know, were playing.
Sure. And have you talked to your children about your experiences in St. Louis?
My son knows more about it because he's older and his appreciation of it is at a depth higher than my daughter's.
Okay.
But no, they knew a lot, but it wasn't a dinner conversation.
Okay.
And it wasn't anything that they saw. Whereas when I was a child, my parents didn't have to tell me. I saw it. We saw it. We saw the racism. We lived it.
Yeah.
And
That's
instead,
a big difference.
we focus on trying to help our children not have to live it.
Is there anything else you'd like to say?
I'm just so grateful to be able to share this part with you. And like I said, I still feel privileged. This is a great life. I have no regrets, no do-overs. It's all in divine order.
Wonderful.
We're in the right place where we're supposed to be at the time we're there. And I have this daughter who's in college at the same university where I went 50 years ago.
Yes.
It has just made me a whole new person.
Wonderful. And you mentioned Rosa Parks. Is there anything more about that?
Well, I'll let my husband share that with you, but
Okay.
the point was that a lot of people don't know. Rosa Parks lived in Los Angeles for at least 10 years during the winter months because her Detroit home, you know, Detroit is just a cold city.
Yes.
And during the colder winters and later years of her life, she just couldn't deal with the weather. So because of the connection with Leo Branton, the attorney, he told her, well, you can come stay with us anytime you want.
Nice.
And Leo's wife was my mother-in-law, and he's my father-in-law. But the whole point was the welcoming of Mrs. Parks into their home
Wonderful.
made a second family for my children that nobody else had. I mean, my daughters and son would go to their grandparents' house in LA, and Mrs. Parks would be sitting there at the table having breakfast. And Mrs. Parks we went to church with her every Sunday. And she was at birthday parties and Christmas parties, and we invited her to our daughter's, Nicole, when she was in the first grade at Windsor Hills Elementary. Mrs. Parks came to the school and took pictures with everybody in the school.
Wonderful.
And she was just like the other grandmother who was there. And we traveled to Japan with her. We traveled to Mexico with her. We traveled to, did we go to Hawaii with her? My husband will remember more of it, but
sure.
for at least 10 years, from 1990 through, because 85, Nicole was 5, through at least 10 more years, every year from Thanksgiving through Easter. When the weather was bad in Detroit, she would stay in LA at my in-laws' house.
I want to make sure you give us the names of your mother and father so it's recorded.
Okay, so my father was Robert Witherspoon Sr. He named his son. This is what dads used to do.
Sure.
So it's Robert L. Witherspoon Sr., St. Louis, Missouri, attorney. And my mother was Freda Crawford Witherspoon.
Very good.
Dr. Freda, we call her.
Yes,
Dr.
wonderful,
Freda.
wonderful.
Yes. And she was a legend all by herself. I hate that I don't talk about my mother more. She has 4 masters and a PhD. She was one of the first black women to get a PhD from St. Louis University, from Washington University, St. Louis. She's the one I think who instilled that love of education in me. She was always reaching higher and higher for more. She was academic accolades.
Absolutely, yeah.
And as her children got older, you know, the role of the mother changes as your children get older. So she did more and more schooling. She went back. And my mother used to take us to Chicago every summer at the beginning of the school year, like early September. And we would go shopping along
Michigan
Michigan
Avenue.
Avenue. Yes, yes. I still have Saks Fifth Avenue labels and some clothes and Marshall Fields. Yes, I mean, and every year we took a family vacation. We did car trips because it was either to a Baptist convention, my dad drove and my mom, my brother and I were in the back seat, and then, or it was a bar convention because my father was very active in the National Bar Association, which is the name of the Black Bar Association, because at the time, black lawyers could not join the White Bar Association. So we had our own conventions, and we went, I remember the year we traveled from St. Louis in the car to Los Angeles to a bar convention, and drove through Death Valley and drove through and saw the Grand Canyon. You know, because in a car trip you get so much education that you just can't get flying. Flying, you start here and you end up where you're going. But we did car trips every year. Every year we took a car trip to wherever the bar convention was. And it was so ironic that my mother started organizations within the Bar Association of the women.
Great.
And she had, it was called Wives of the Bench and Bar. And while the men were doing all those important men things that they do at law conventions, she had organized the women to do things with our children, because that's what it became.
Wonderful.
So we would go to see monuments within the city where we were, or we would go to museums in the city where
The
bar.
educator, your mother, the educator.
Yes, she
Constant.
absolutely was.
4 masters?
Yes.
In what?
One was, clearly one was in education. The PhD was Dr. Philosophy. The other part, one was in sociology. One was, what was the other one called? I need to look back in the archives. I'm sure it's from the schools.
Yes.
But yeah,
Her PhD was in?
It was a Dr. Philosophy, and I don't know what the other part of that would be. But it was from Washington University.
Was it in sociology or education?
It was from education.
Ah, okay, very good, wonderful. Yeah.
Yep, she was education. I should be ashamed of myself. That
No,
I can't.
no,
No, but I'm sure.
No, obviously.
I have a picture in my bedroom to this day.
Continually wanting to learn, which is such a good
in my
thing.
cap and gown, and her in her cap and gown when she got her PhD.
Nice.
Yes.
Nice, wonderful, excellent.
Yes.
Again, anything else before we?
Not really.
Okay.
I definitely don't want to leave her out of the picture, though.
No, I
because she
understand.
became more famous in St. Louis
Yes.
than my dad.
Yes.
Because my dad's legend was clearly along the lines of the legal profession
Right.
and the legal milestones. But my mom was an organizer. She was
Organizer of what?
of clubs and of women
Okay.
and there weren't sororities, but there were just groups of women who would come together and do things for the betterment of children.
Of the children.
And it wasn't just our own children. It
The
was
community.
everybody's children. Yes. We worked with an orphanage called Annie Malone's Children's Home, and we would go there, and I know we would take clothes and food and do things that were very civic-minded. She was very active in the NAACP, of course, and the Urban League, of course. And she was the faculty representative for so the high school where she worked, you know how when you want a club in the high school, you need a faculty representative?
Right.
So she was a faculty representative for the drama club in the high
wonderful.
school where she was when I was in elementary school. And she was just very, very active, very, very established part of the St. Louis, I'll just call it social community. But
Wonderful.
yes.
So, amazing leader it sounds like she
Yes.
is. Yes, wonderful.
Yes, absolutely.
Very
She
good.
she taught Maxine Waters. Maxine Waters, who is the legislator here.
Sure.
She was in the high school where Maxine was, and to this day, Maxine remembers her. And also Bobby Parks, who was the wife of Bernard Parks, the chief of police here. She's from St. Louis, and she went to the high school where my mother taught.
Wow.
And they still remember, especially Maxine, every time I see her, she remembers the kind of, whatever that word is, that you instill in young people without saying anything to them, but it's by your demeanor and by the way you look or the way you dress. I mean, my mother was always in heels and stockings and well dressed, as opposed to, I look at some teachers now and I could never tell that they were teachers.
I know.
It was just a way we carried ourselves.
Absolutely.
That people, it's the first impression is, you know, it's still
I agree.
true, lasting.